Religion in Tibet, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, is really a center of Tibetan culture and Tibetan identity. And for China to effectively control Tibet, then you really have to destroy that religion, or at least limit it. That is very essential, and the Chinese know this.
Since China's invasion of Tibet in 1949, the Tibetan people have struggled for the right to practice their religion freely. Though the memory of China's violent attacks on Tibetan Buddhism remains, over the last 2 decades, Tibetans have devoted themselves to rebuilding thousands of monasteries, and religious practice has accelerated across the Tibetan plateau. But China's top leaders have expressed deep concern about the continued popularity and rapid growth of Tibetan Buddhism, and a new wave of Communist Party policies to stifle the spread of religion in Tibet leaves the future of Tibetan Buddhism in its homeland uncertain. Today, the Dalai Lama, Tibet's exiled spiritual and temporal leader, remains in India, where he urges for negotiations with the Chinese leadership. And inside Tibet, the struggle for religious freedom continues.
We don't expect that if we shout for religious freedom or human rights in Tibet that these will be granted straight away. But even if I was beaten, killed, or imprisoned, even if I could only shout a few words, it would help the Tibetan people.
Maybe if our tourists go to Tibet, they will see a monastery, monks chanting, and people are burning their butter lamps, all those things. But this is one level that is these days permitted to do that. But Tibetan Buddhism is, I think, it's more than that. It's more than just some kind of a ceremonial thing. You have to study, you have to be trained, and in that level, there's a very little freedom to do these kind of things.
You can wear red, but you can't fully practice. We couldn't invite teachers to our nunnery at all. We couldn't even go to receive teachings elsewhere. We would have to ask permission from the local authorities to go for teachings or to invite lamas. There were a few older nuns, and they taught us to recite and memorize manuscripts. But there wasn't a deep religious knowledge like there used to be.
Tibet's monastic tradition began more than 1,200 years ago. The teachings focused on the Buddha's path to enlightenment through mental discipline and compassion for all living beings. The monasteries developed a sophisticated educational system that required a lifelong commitment to contemplation and study. Monks and nuns trained in Buddhist philosophy, debate, and meditation, as well as mathematics, medicine, literature, and the ritual arts. More than 6,000 monasteries would be constructed across the Tibetan plateau, housing hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns. And as the religious infrastructure grew, so did its political, economic, and social influence on Tibetan society.
These institutions become so large, and their power and their impact is so large that, it's difficult in that society to flourish in other ideas and other sort of, parts of civil society.
Buddhism shaped the worldview of the vast majority of Tibetans, whose lives were integrally linked with Tibet's religious institutions. But in 1959, Chinese communist aggression drove the 23-year-old Dalai Lama into exile. and Mao Zedong's government began a massive campaign to shut down Tibet's monasteries. Virtually all of Tibet's monks and nuns were forcefully disrobed and sent back to their villages, sent to labor camps, imprisoned, or killed. The campaign intensified in 1965 when the communist government told Tibetans that their Buddhist beliefs were superstitious and backward, that they must be abandoned in order to modernize Tibet. Mao's Cultural Revolution had begun.
The monasteries were razed through artillery, shells, and people just tearing monasteries apart with their bare hands. And there were a lot of Chinese Red Guards that came up from China to do this. But there were also a lot of Tibetans engaged in it. China was successful in creating this zealous group of people willing to tear down a whole society.
Then there are some Tibetans, they thought this is a good thing. This is their advancing their society, their civilization. This is a march toward the modernization, this march toward communism. When you are so overwhelmed by a huge state like China, with such a huge sort of a political movement, with all the ideology, with the bombardment with the propaganda, and without hearing anything else than what the state is saying, and anybody who's sort of counter to these ideas will be just punished by, imprisonment and parade to the street and humiliate you. It's difficult to resist for anybody.
The attacks on Buddhism and the forced abandonment of religious practice devastated the Tibetan people. The Cultural Revolution destroyed all but a handful of the 6,000 monasteries in Tibet. It would take more than a decade and a change of Chinese leadership for Buddhism to resurface from the ruins. In the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping's reform policies allowed for the limited reinstitution of prayer festivals and the reconstruction of monasteries. Though heavily monitored by Communist Party officials, Tibetans took advantage of the chance to once again publicly embrace their culture.
That was really in the Tibetan religion sort of renaissance period. And my generation, maybe even a little older than me or younger than me, maybe I think that time we had very little idea about Tibetan Buddhism, what it means, what it's teaching. But certainly we identify with our identity.
Perhaps the most impressive example of the resurgence of religious life occurred at Larangar in Kham, eastern Tibet. Under the guidance of a Buddhist monk and accomplished meditator named Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, Buddhism was undergoing a revival not seen in Tibet since China's occupation. Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok avoided persecution during the Cultural Revolution by taking his Buddhist practice into the isolated mountains of Sertar County. In the early 1980s, he began teaching a handful of monks and nuns in a nearby valley. Over the next 2 decades, he attracted increasing numbers of monks and nuns who built their own one-room adobe huts near his residence. The community became known as the Larangar Buddhist Institute. Because it wasn't registered as a monastery, the monks and nuns hoped that they wouldn't be subject to the burdensome regulations that monasteries came under. It was a spontaneous gathering of monks and nuns around a charismatic teacher. Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok trained thousands in Buddhist philosophy and meditation with his rigorous course of study. And Larangar produced hundreds of qualified teachers who have since helped to regenerate genuine Buddhist practice in many other parts of Tibet. A Authorities in Beijing didn't anticipate the resurgence of spiritual activity across the Tibetan plateau in the 1980s and 90s. The government provided little support for religious institutions, and communist leaders believed that the Tibetan people's religious faith would diminish with increased economic and social development in Tibet. Instead, Tibetans resisted Chinese occupation with the expression of their Buddhist identity and devotion to the Dalai Lama. Tibetans continued to rebuild and sustain the monasteries with voluntary donations of money and labor.
Certainly, this is the one way to express Tibetans, to say, no, that's not who we are, we have something else, and we identify with the religion, and to saying that we are different from the Chinese, and we feel the difference. And it was quite a proud moment in a lot of Tibetans' life.
This growing expression of religious pride, ethnic identity, and loyalty to the Dalai Lama threatened the Communist Party's vision of national unity. In the mid-90s, authorities in the Tibetan capital Lhasa launched an intensive patriotic education campaign to suppress it. Patriotic education continues in monasteries and lay communities throughout Tibet today. The sessions are often led by Tibetans who have become members of the Chinese Communist Party. In the sessions, they assert that Tibet has always been a part of China, that Tibetans must love the motherland and the Chinese people, and uphold the leadership of the Communist Party.
Some Tibetans fully believe what they're saying because they've been brainwashed by the Chinese. But I believe most Tibetans do it because their livelihoods depend on it.
Tibetans are required to study and often memorize Marxist doctrine, and they are forced to denounce the Dalai Lama, whom China characterizes as a threat to the unity of the motherland and an obstacle to the proper development of Tibet.
When meetings were held, anybody over the age of 18 had to go. And if they said that whole families had to attend, then we had to. We couldn't say we had other work to do.
야나 정권주 미마 시숑기 아니 대비 달체제 지로네 배배 병행의 주발이야 다 토담체고 와르스 나 단다 카데 rum로바 용시에 이거는 별랑대 인세 깨져게 드라마를 시에요 봐 자와찬에 지도 대자 야우시라요 내도도 용시 말에 얘네 뭐중만 거세요 시라 깨침 비도가 너무 저야 나도야 봐지게 지도 토아야 토담들이야 지부슈야.
In the monasteries, the sessions are designed to identify, expel, or arrest dissident monks and nuns whose Buddhist beliefs or political views conflict with Communist Party principles. The classes can last from 5 days to 3 months. At the end, monks and nuns are forced to sign a document declaring their opposition to the Dalai Lama and professing loyalty to the Communist Party. A refusal to sign can lead to expulsion from the monastery or imprisonment.
Whenever they called us, we had to go no matter what. We didn't have the right to say no. Sometimes they would call us to class during prayer sessions, and we had to go. They would say His Holiness the Dalai Lama was a splittist. They would make us call him bad names and denounce him. That's impossible for us. We'd rather be expelled from the nunnery than denounce the Dalai Lama.
They know that what Tibetan people really feel about Dalai Lama. They believe that if you can just repeat lies for 1,000 times, and some people will be fooled by it. And they believe in their propaganda because that's the only way they know how to address the issues.
So monasteries were seen as hotbeds of dissident activity and pro-independent sentiment, which in large part was true. Monasteries in some ways are like universities that way. You get a lot of young monks or nuns together, and they're going to talk amongst themselves and take action.
China learned that lesson in the late 80s and early 90s, when the Dalai Lama appealed to the international community to help negotiate a political compromise. Genuine autonomy for Tibetans within China. Beijing's rejection of the Dalai Lama's proposal and criticism of him in the Chinese press sparked a revitalized movement for Tibetan independence in the monasteries of central Tibet. Demonstrations erupted in Lhasa. Brutal reprisals from Chinese military killed scores in Lhasa streets. More than 1,000 monks and nuns were imprisoned and tortured. More than half of Tibet's political prisoners are monks and nuns, some with sentences as long as 18 years. Ani Choying Kunsang spent 4 years in Dropji prison for demonstrating in Lhasa's main bazaar in 1995. She shouted for religious freedom, human rights, and independence. She was charged with endangering state security. When Ani Choying expressed her religious or political beliefs in prison, she was stripped naked, beaten by groups of male guards, and shocked with an electric cattle prod.
They'd use electric batons on our mouths, on our heads, and on the palms of our hands, and beat us with long black rubber pipes. They hit me many times. I had gashes on my head, and my nose bled. I received many punishments like these.
According to the U.S. State Department's annual human rights reports, the torture and abuse of detained monks and nuns occurs routinely in Tibet. In addition to severe beatings, common forms of torture include exposure to extreme heat and cold, hanging by extremities, deprivation of sleep, and electric shock to the genitals.
Even if we are killed after shouting a few words, I still think that it's worth it. If we remained silent, didn't protest in any way, and only listened to the Chinese, then what little religion we can practice in Tibet would disappear altogether.
Increasingly, a lot of the communist cadres realize that this official doctrine of religion withering away isn't really part of human nature and human society. So I think there is a growing realization that religion is here to stay, and China sees it more of a job of just how they manage it so that it doesn't become a threat, it doesn't become a source of power for people to start living and thinking independently.
To monitor compliance with party guidelines, China closely regulates the activities of Tibet's prominent religious figures. The most influential are those believed to be reincarnations of eminent Buddhist teachers from the past. Tibetans regard such reincarnations as holy beings, and while the Dalai Lama is the best-known example of a recognized reincarnation, there are hundreds of others across Tibet.
I think the goal certainly is to try to make sure that the reincarnations that are brought up in Tibet are more obedient to China. They become the leaders in Tibetan society. I think China realizes that they can't get rid of them, so they're going to co-opt them.
In 1992, at the age of 7, Ugyen Tenle Dorje was enthroned as the 17th Karmapa. one of the most important reincarnated figures in Tibetan Buddhism. Communist officials attended the enthronement, where they publicly announced their claim to the historical and legal right to appoint what they called living Buddhas in Tibet. Authorities hoped to mold the Karmapa into a patriotic monk and use him as a mouthpiece for the Communist Party.
They just had huge, media sort of spinning around him from beginning, when the Karmapa was recognized by Chinese government and, took him to Beijing and meeting with Jiang Zemin, and 8 or 9 years old, Karmapa was praising the economic development in Tibet. At the time, they thought that this is going to work, by developing economic. They're grooming those Lama, and then we don't have to worry about the Dalai Lama, and then Tibetans will be happy.
The Karmapa spent his youth under the strict management of local officials, without access to the teachings and training he needed as the emerging spiritual head of an ancient Buddhist lineage. But he refused to compromise his religious education for the party. And like tens of thousands of monks and nuns before him, who fled over the Himalayas to seek a better education in the Tibetan exile monasteries of India, so too did the 14-year-old Karmapa in 1999.
It was a very daring escape, which was really embarrassing for China. And it's a great loss, I think, for Tibetans not to have him there in Tibet, even though now he's able to get a real education and a proper education that he, as a Karmapa, should. I think it's really unfortunate that China couldn't have allowed him a little more breathing room and that he couldn't have remained.
Even more influential in Tibetan society is the Panchen Lama, another reincarnation that China has sought to bring under its control. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Panchen Lama shares a unique relationship with the Dalai Lama, in which the elder of the two is responsible for identifying and mentoring the younger. The previous Panchen Lama, Choki Gyaltsen, advocated for religious freedom throughout his life and spent more than a decade in prison for his criticism of Chinese policies in Tibet. After his release, he again devoted himself to restoring Tibetan identity and religious freedom until he died mysteriously in 1989 at the age of 50, just as his open condemnation of Chinese policies intensified. Despite Beijing's efforts to control the search for the Panchen Lama's reincarnation, over the next few years, Tibetans would smuggle information and photographs of the candidates to India for the Dalai Lama's consideration. And in May of 1995, the Dalai Lama identified the 11th Panchen Lama. His name was Gendon Choki Nyima. He came from a remote part of central Tibet called Nagchu, and he was 6 years old.
China waited a few days to figure out what their response was going to be, and then decided that this little boy should disappear.
Gendon Choki Nyima and his parents were abducted and taken to Beijing. They have been held incommunicado ever since. Authorities stated that the selection of the Panchen Lama was an internal matter, and that the Dalai Lama had no right to determine reincarnations. 6 months later, they staged a highly publicized lottery to choose their own Panchen Lama from a group of Communist Party-approved candidates. Their selection, Gyaltsen Norbu, was enthroned in front of Tibet's most sacred shrine in December of 1995.
Chinese communist, who doesn't believe any afterlife or any sort of religion in any sense. It's ridiculous. I know inside Tibet, this is painful, just interfering in a lot of people's belief system, a lot of people's whole cultural system. And, as much as many Tibetans in some ways hostile to that, the boy appointed by the Chinese government, I think there's nothing to be blamed on this little child, which has been a tragedy in this political mess.
While authorities continue to groom Gyaltsen Norbu to be a patriotic Lama, Gendon Choki Nyima, now a teenager, remains under house arrest. Since the Panchen Lama dispute, monasteries are often required to display government-distributed photographs of the Chinese-chosen Panchen Lama, and images of both Gendun Choki Nyima and the Dalai Lama are officially banned in Tibet.
Used to be in the late 80s that you would see photos of the Dalai Lama in the market, and by the mid-90s the photos were nowhere to be seen, and they were nowhere to be seen inside monasteries. But if you knew where to look, you could find Tibetans just about always had photos of the Dalai Lama behind some other photo. And so it was always covered up, but they were still there.
While some Tibetans softly resisted state control of their religion by concealing photographs of the Dalai Lama from authorities, others resisted more openly. In 1998, Tibetans held a massive prayer ceremony for the Dalai Lama's long life near the town of Kanze in Kham, eastern Tibet. A local monk and scholar named Geshe Sonam Phuntsok organized the prayers. Tibetans in Kanze revered Geshe Sonam Phuntsok for his help with the reconstruction of several monasteries and the development of social welfare projects in the Kanze area. Over the years, he also taught Tibetan language to thousands of young monks, nuns, and children of nomads.
He attracted more attention from the authorities because they realized that this man was someone who had a lot of clout, and even though he wasn't political, neither was he totally under their control. And after these long life prayers, he was the target of the wrath of the party.
In October of 1999, Geshe Sonam Phuntsok was arrested for leading the prayers. Charged with engaging in activities to separate the motherland, he denied having ever advocated for Tibetan independence. His arrest sparked massive protest, resulting in a heightened military presence and increased surveillance in Kanze. At his trial, Geshe Sonam Phuntsok admitted to having organized prayers for the Dalai Lama, but argued that such activities do not harm the national unity of the People's Republic of China. He was sentenced to 5 years in Nakba prison. Despite the crackdowns in Kanze in the late 90s, in neighboring Sartar County, the Larangar Buddhist Institute continued to grow. By 2001, more than 8,000 students resided at Larangar, which had become the cultural nexus of the surrounding lay communities. Larangar not only attracted Tibetans, but also drew more than 1,000 Chinese.
There are more and more Chinese people who have greater interest in religion in general, spiritual life in general, but in Buddhism and in Tibetan Buddhism in particular. And you can see that more and more people go to Tibet and want to learn more about why Tibetan people are so devoted into their religion and what's there for them.
Now this extra layer of implications that Tibetan Buddhism may going to have an impact in the Chinese society, and in that case, what does it mean to the state?
Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok's increasing popularity among Chinese Buddhists and the sheer number of monks and nuns at Larangar alarmed Beijing.
If people devote in the religion and have a large gathering, they're afraid they'll turn into some political rebellion. They're fundamentally insecure of the land and the people who they occupy, and they want control.
despite the fact that the Institute had no history of political activism and carefully followed party guidelines with respect to the Dalai Lama. Larangar became the target of a campaign to decrease the number of monks and nuns permitted in monasteries. Monasteries no longer had to be politically active to come under attack. They just had to grow large enough to worry authorities. Officials ordered Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok to reduce the number of monks and nuns by sending them home. Unwilling to do so, he appealed to authorities to protect their freedom of religion in accordance with China's constitution.
The Chinese constitution has quite a lofty words, from freedom of expression, freedom of association, to freedom of religion. Yeah. But there is also a guiding line above that, which is the Chinese Communist Party is the leading party of this country. In other words, that's it. Whatever rest of say on paper, it doesn't really mean much, if anything threatening the fundamental interest of Chinese Communist Party.
Work teams backed by army personnel arrived in June of 2001 to implement the expulsion of over 6,000 monks and nuns, including all Chinese. Officials paid hundreds of migrant workers 250 yuan, about $32 for each dwelling they destroyed. With the demolition of over 3,000 residential quarters, authorities prevented monks and nuns from returning.
That was a really bad indication how far they are willing to go if they need to. Without international concern, I think China will have a free hand to do whatever they want to.
Chinese people has the responsibility not only for a democratic government itself, but also to make sure the Tibetans and every ethnic groups the Chinese living with together, no matter what kind of political solution will come out, that they can live with, they are happy with, and their fundamental freedom and rights are being respected. And that is a long road.
I have great hope that China is really in the midst of a transition, and China will change. I believe so. I think they will see the value of Tibetan Buddhism as part of a diverse culture. It's not going to be a threat to the state if they be open-minded. But I think before we reach to that stage, I think Tibetans have to struggle inside Tibet, and outside the international community need to make sure that their voices be heard.